Part 17. Panama Hotel, 1:09 a.m. A shadow among shadows, the Terminator climbed with slow, patient steps up the fire escape to his second-story window. It avoided using its dysfunctioning right wrist until it could determine the full extent of the damage it had sustained in the initial combat. It had taken the cyborg nearly an hour to get from the site of the crash back to its hotel room. It had moved on foot for the first couple of miles, allowing the systems to come fully online in order to assess their condition. Aside from the wrist, there was almost total visual occlusion of the left eye. The eye itself seemed to be functioning properly. It was the surrounding tissue that was hindering performance. Now, the Terminator pushed open the hotel room window and slipped inside. It quickly scanned the near black interior. Nothing had been touched. No intruders. In one stride it was across the tiny cell and flicking on the single bare bulb above the grimy sink. In the full light, it took a look at itself. The eyebrows were gone, completely singed off. What remained of the hair was little more than charred stubble. The socket surrounding its left eye was a pulpy red mass of randomly attached shreds of flesh. Glass fragments were embedded all around it. 7 gunshot wounds and lacerations covered the shoulders, chest, and arms. Pulpy craters filled with congealed blood and 12-gauge pellets. Internal status readouts indicated that damage to the armored chassis beneath was superficial. The only real problem was the wrist. A shotgun blast had torn through the exterior layer of skin and punched into the servo-actuated control system beneath. Carefully, it laid out its tools on a folding table near the sink. The charred remains of the jacket were quickly stripped off and flung into the corner. The Terminator took a seat and gingerly laid the damaged arm on the tabletop. The arm looked bad, much worse than it actually was. Blood flowed over and around the Swiss cheese remains of the skin covering the wound. The Terminator was not disturbed. The term pain was irrelevant. Only functional impairment of combat effectiveness was of concern here. With an expression of mild concentration, it selected an X-Acto knife and nervelessly made a 6-inch incision along the inside of the forearm. Tying the flaps of skin back with locking hemostats, it peered into the exposed cavity. By wriggling its fingers, it could clearly see the problem. One of the control cables in the complex trunk of sheathed machinery and hydraulics had been severed. The cyborg wiped away the blood and, using its good eye, began to patiently disassemble the damaged part with a jeweler's screwdriver. If the Terminator had been programmed to hum, the picture would have been complete. In a few moments, the cable was bypassed, function assigned to a redundant hydraulic system, and the incision sewn shut to keep the forearm skin from crudely shifting around. This would have led to premature tissue necrosis, gangrene, and an unacceptable social attention index. Standing above the fouled sink, the Terminator examined the lacerated eye. The lens was fine. Vision impairment was due to the shredded flesh around it. Clearing it would not take long. The X-Acto blade sunk into the gory socket, and in a few smooth cuts, scooped out the ruined sclera and cornea. With a faint plop, it fell into the sink basin and slowly drifted through the water to the bottom, leaving an expanding pink trail. The Terminator dabbed at the socket, soaking up the excess blood. Now the chrome-like alloy sphere was clearly visible, suspended within the metal socket by tiny servos, its high-resolution video tube glowing behind the concussion-proof lens. They were functioning acceptably. However, there was no way to easily explain away its radical appearance. But anyway, the Terminator was not much of a talker. It fished a pair of sunglasses from the small hoard of clothes and equipment it had gathered and put them on. Its eye was barely visible beneath the dark shades, which were a wraparound design that even hid the damage from the side. The Terminator went to work on the chest and abdominal wounds, pulling the ventilated tissue closed over the dented carapace of its hyperalloy torso chassis, then suturing it crudely with household thread. It had to dig around a bit in the interstices of the shoulder assembly between the axial drive motor housing and the clavicular trailing link. It got most of the shotgun pellets that were impeding the movement there. The muscle tissue was shredded and detached, but since it was merely a superficial camouflage and not actually responsible for locomotion, the Terminator packed it back into the wound and sewed it shut, with little regard for surgical deftness. With a new t-shirt, a pair of leather gloves, and the collar of the black leather jacket turned up, the cyborg looked almost normal, if a little pale and gaunt. Starting with the A's, the Terminator rapidly dialed every police station in Los Angeles until it reached Rampart Division. Now it was time to move out. The target was waiting. The Terminator flipped the stained mattress to the floor and collected the required tools to complete the mission. The SPAS-12 auto shotgun, a 5.56mm AR-180 assault rifle, its sear pin filed for full auto, and a 38 special. Just the essentials. With the grace of a servo motor precision, the Terminator hefted the weapons and disappeared out the window into the Los Angeles night. LAPD, Rampart Division, 2:10 a.m. Sarah leaned forward, perched on the edge of a swiveling desk chair, and gazed at the image on the video monitor before her. Traxler stood next to her. He was continually gauging her reaction. He wanted her to see this. It might trigger something she had forgotten to tell him. Silberman reached over and turned up the volume on the black and white monitor. "It's just him and me," Reese said from the video monitor. "Why didn't you bring any weapons?" Silberman's recorded image asked. "Something more advanced. Don't you have ray guns?" "Ray guns," Vukovic repeated, chuckling. On the screen, Reese was not amused at all. He glared back defiantly. Silberman paused. "Come on," he said. "Show me one single piece of future technology and we can settle this whole thing. You go naked. Something to do with the field generated by a living organism. Nothing dead will go." "Why?" "I didn't build the fucking thing," Reese retorted. He was starting to lose it. Okay, but this, Silberman glanced down at his notes. "This cyborg, if it's metal, how surrounded by living tissue?" "Of course." Silberman nodded, understandingly on the video screen. The real Silberman got up from Traxler's desk and punched the pause button on the monitor. When he turned to Sarah and Traxler, his voice was self-congratulatory. "This is great stuff," he babbled. "I could make a career out of this guy. You see how clever this part is? It doesn't require a shred of proof." Sarah looked up at him, still unsure, puzzled. "Most paranoid delusions are intricate," he continued, "but this is brilliant." "And so am I," he thought to himself as he restarted the tape. "Why were the other two women killed?" the black and white Silberman asked. "Most records were damaged or lost in the war," Reese said. "Skynet knew almost nothing about Connor's mother because her file was incomplete. It knew her name and where she lived. Just the city, not the address. The Terminator was being systematic." "What about the incisions in their legs?" "It was the only physical identification left in her records. Sarah had a metal pin surgically implanted in her leg. What Skynet didn't know, what the Terminator doesn't know, is that she doesn't have it yet. That's supposed to happen later." "How do you know?" "John told me." "John Connor?" Silberman asked. "Yes." Silberman tapped his pencil on the pad, thinking, a tiny smile unconsciously on his lips. "You realize there's no physical proof of this either?" "You've heard enough," Reese said. his voice filled with anger. "Decide, now! Are you going to release me?" "I'm afraid that's not up to me," Silberman answered, keeping his voice friendly and reasonable. "Then why am I talking to you?" Reese started to stand, still handcuffed to the chair. "Who is in authority here?" "I can help you." Silberman was trying to stay in control of the situation, and losing. Reese was on his feet now, staring straight into the camera, right at Sarah, and shouting. "You still don't get it, do you? He'll find her. That's what he does. It's all he does." Sarah's eyes went wide. Traxler gestured to Silberman, who was closer to the monitor, to shut it off. But Silberman was watching the screen, fascinated by the performance there. "You can't stop him. He'll wade through you, reach down her throat, and pull her fucking heart out." Reese was trying to climb through the monitor when Silberman snapped out of his reverie and hit the pause button, stopping him. Sarah was transfixed by the desperate will etched in Reese's electronically frozen face. She was pale. So many questions were racing through her mind that she couldn't keep them straight. "I don't have a pin in my leg," she said. "Of course not," Traxler replied. "Reese is a very disturbed man." Sarah wanted to believe that. She turned to the psychologist for a more professional opinion, one she could believe. "Is Reese crazy?" she asked. "In technical terminology," Silberman answered, smiling, "he's a loon." "But..." Sarah started to protest when Traxler cut her off. He handed her something that looked like an umpire's protective padding. "Sarah, this is body armor. Our SWAT guys wear it. It'll stop a 12-gauge round. This other individual must have had one on under his coat." She wanted to believe that was the explanation, but somehow it wasn't enough. "But what about him punching through the windscreen?" Vukovic shrugged. "He's probably on PCP, broke every bone in his hand, and won't feel it for hours. There was this guy once." Traxler cut him off by dumping the bulletproof vest into his hands. Dutifully, Vukovic shut up and sauntered away. PCP. Sarah had read about people on drugs doing incredible things in a berserk rage. Maybe, she thought. That must be it. It wasn't so much that she believed it, but that she needed to believe it. And these guys seemed so certain. She suddenly felt gullible, with a hot flush of embarrassment at her own stupidity. To have been drawn into belief in that demented story of Reese's. But he had seemed so compelling, and his account of the future so detailed, even down to the tattoo on his arm. Self-inflicted, no doubt. There are some 5-star wackos out there, she thought, and I just found myself 2 of them. Still, though she refused to address it, there remained a nagging background chatter of unvoiced doubts. Traxler put a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You're gonna be okay," he said, and despite his world-weary gruffness, Sarah sensed true concern. "I've called your mother and told her the situation. This hasn't hit the news yet, so she hadn't heard a thing about it." "How did she sound?" "Pretty good. She just said, 'I'm on my way,' and hung up." That's my mother, Sarah thought, the crisis management expert. 17 years as a registered nurse will do that to you. Sarah wished she had a bit more of that pragmatic toughness. Find out your daughter has been abducted by a mad gunman and involved in a running gun battle, and that her best friend was killed by mistake in her place. No problem, just grab the car keys. It'll take her at least an hour and a half to get here from San Bernardino. Why don't you just stretch out in this office and get some sleep? He gestured through the door to a small adjoining office and a sway-backed couch against the wall. "I can't sleep," she said. Though racked to the limit with physical and emotional exhaustion, Sarah knew that sleep was far off. Her brain whirled with half-formed images of destruction that would take years to fade, and memories made bright and bitter by the loss of Ginger and Matt. She shuffled like a sleepwalker, then sat down on the couch, Traxler kneeling beside her. "It may not look like it, but this couch is pretty comfortable. I spent a few nights here myself. Now just stretch out and don't worry." Sarah did lie down, but her eyes stayed open, unwilling to shut out the bright safety of the office. "You'll be perfectly safe," Traxler said soothingly. "There's 30 cops in this building. How much safer can you get?" He smiled and patted her arm, then rose to his feet. She heard his shoulder holster creak as he stood and saw the blue steel of his service revolver. His hands were delicate, but his arms were thick and his shoulders broad. She took comfort in the images. The .357 under his arm, the badge clipped to his belt, the thick-soled cop shoes she'd always thought looked so outdated and silly. They didn't seem silly now. She let her breath out slowly, and her strength seemed to go with it. Her eyes closed. Traxler backed out the door and shut it quietly, leaving the light on. He stood outside the door, pulling on his chin. His eyes, focusing on nothing, looked big and vacant in his bifocals. Vukovic knew that look. "What?" he said. "There's something going on here." "Bullshit," Vukovic said. "Couple of wackos, that's all." "Right. Sharing the same delusion. How often does that happen?" Vukovic sighed in frustration. "Man, you're losing it. Have another cup of coffee. Have another juicy fruit, pal. The kid's a wacko, Ed." "He'd better be," Traxler said, gaze still distant. The kid was smart and tough, as if he'd been drop-forged and come out tempered like no street punk he'd seen. Some of the NARM Special Forces guys had that look, but this one was too young for NARM. 19, 20. He would have been 4 during the Tet Offensive. It wasn't adding up, and something was setting off his radar. "Wacko," Vukovic said, handing him a smoke. Traxler caught his eye. "Think about something for a second. Just play the hand and think it through," Traxler said. "What's that?" Traxler lit the cigarette. "What if he's not